In the quiet forests of ancient India, long before temples rose and scriptures were written, there lived a man whose silence stirred the deepest questions of the soul. He was not a prophet sent by a divine will, nor a preacher declaring the glory of a heavenly realm. He was simply called the Buddha, the Awakened One. What made him different was not just his teachings, but what he chose not to teach. At a time when India was teeming with gods, creators, destroyers, protectors, and judges, the Buddha did not speak of any. While other sages declared truths received from the heavens, he said only, "Come and see for yourself." For over 2,000 years, this silence has puzzled scholars and inspired seekers. Was the Buddha avoiding the question of God? Or did he see something so radical that it made the idea of a creator completely irrelevant? This story is not merely about theology, nor a comparison of religions. It is about a deeper insight into reality, a vision that dissolves the need for a creator, not through denial, but through direct understanding. In this journey, we will explore the philosophical, psychological, and spiritual dimensions behind this silence. We will follow the Buddha's own words in the Pāli canon, often overlooked, often misread, and rediscover a universe not created, but conditioned, not controlled, but unfolding. We will meet kings who asked him about the soul, priests who demanded answers about Brahma, and wanderers who questioned the origin of the world. And each time, the Buddha responded not with dogma, but with a mirror. Understand this mind, and you will understand the cosmos. Prepare to enter a world where the ground of being is not a god, but a process. A vision where everything arises due to causes and nothing exists independently. A teaching so radical that it changed the spiritual map of humanity and still challenges it today. I do not argue with the world. It is the world that argues with me. Before the Buddha walked barefoot through the mango groves of India, before he sat under the Bodhi tree and shattered the illusion of self, the world he was born into was already old, ancient, filled with gods. India, at the time, was not short of creation stories. The sacred Vedas had already been chanted for centuries, invoking Agni the fire, Indra the thunder wielder, Varua the guardian of cosmic order, and above all, Brahma, the supposed creator and sustainer of all existence. The world was enchanted, divine. Every river was a goddess, every mountain the home of a deity. Kings ruled by divine right, and priests, the Brahmins, acted as the mediators between man and heaven. Rituals were not just cultural habits, they were cosmic transactions. To plant, to harvest, to marry, to die, each action was to be consecrated with mantras, oblations, and invocations to unseen powers. The universe was imagined as a grand sacrifice, where even the gods depended on humans to feed them with fire and offerings. In this sacred theater, creation was not a question, it was a given. The gods had made the world. The world had meaning because it came from divine will. The suffering of life, the caste into which one was born, even the fate after death, everything was woven into this framework. People did not question who created the world. They questioned how to please the creators, how to escape their wrath, or win their favor. The problem was not existence, but alignment. And so, to reject the creator, to say, "There is no God who made you," was not only heresy, it was madness. To question the sacred order was to risk being cast out, not just from society, but from the order of the cosmos itself. But then came this man, born as a prince, raised among dancers and silk and luxury. He could have followed the script, become a king, offered sacrifices, ruled with Dharma, died, and ascended to the heavens. But something burned in him. The stories about gods did not explain suffering. The prayers did not halt death. The rituals did not protect the innocent. The gods themselves, he noticed, were subject to change, to emotion, to craving. And if the gods craved, aged, died, or were reborn, what kind of immortality was that? The young prince saw something that the priests did not. Even the highest beings were caught in the cycle, the same wheel of birth and death that tormented animals and men. He began to suspect that there was something deeper than creation stories, something beneath the surface of all religious noise. When he left the palace and saw an old man, a sick man, a corpse, and a monk, his mind turned from the heavens to the question of human suffering. And when he finally renounced his throne and walked into the forest, he was not searching for a creator. He was searching for a way out. The sages he encountered still spoke in the language of gods and heavens. Some claimed that Brahma was the source of all things. Others said the self was eternal, indestructible, one with the cosmos. Some practiced severe austerities to force the gods to respond. But none of their answers satisfied the deeper wound in him. They gave names to the mystery, but not understanding. And so he turned inward. What he found, after 6 years of silence, meditation, and a final moment of clarity beneath the Bodhi tree, was not a god, not a voice, not a divine message. He found a truth so simple it needed no belief, a pattern so universal it explained not just men and gods, but reality itself. Everything that arises does so because of causes, and everything that ceases does so because those causes cease. This was the heartbeat of the cosmos, not the will of a creator, but the law of conditionality. In that moment of awakening, the Buddha saw that the world had no beginning because it was never truly created. It simply arose, moment by moment, from conditions. No outside force pulled the strings. No divine being had drawn the first breath of time. The universe, like the mind, was a process, not a product. And so, for the rest of his 45 years of teaching, he never mentioned a creator God, not because he hated the idea, nor because he had no answer, but because he saw something deeper. He saw that to ask, who made the world, is to ask the wrong question. The real question was, why do we suffer? And how do we end it? In a world overflowing with gods, the Buddha offered something more radical, freedom without a master. Whether the world is eternal or not, whether it is finite or infinite, I do not declare. He was a man of boundless insight. But he remained silent when asked the questions that mattered most to other men. Why? Throughout his long teaching career, the Buddha was approached by seekers, wanderers, and priests who brought to him the great metaphysical questions of the age. These were not idle inquiries. They were existential wounds disguised as philosophy, burning questions that haunted the human mind for millennia. Is the universe eternal or not? Is the self identical with the body, or separate from it? Does the Tathagata exist after death or not? Is there a beginning to the world? Was it created by a god? To these, the Buddha gave no answer. He did not speculate. He did not entertain. He did not engage. When pressed, he would look with compassion in his eyes and say simply, I do not declare that. This refusal was shocking, especially in a time when spiritual teachers made their reputation by offering elaborate cosmologies and claiming privileged access to divine truths. To admit, as the Buddha did, that one would not take a position on such questions was, to many, a sign of ignorance or evasion. But those who accused him of avoiding the truth had not understood his vision. His silence was not born of ignorance, but from a clarity too sharp for words. In the Pāli texts, there is a striking encounter between the Buddha and a wandering ascetic named Mlukyapada. The monk, growing restless in his practice, approached the Buddha and declared, Venerable Sir, if the Blessed One does not explain to me whether the world is eternal or not, whether the self exists after death or not, I will abandon this life of renunciation. The Buddha responded not with doctrine, but with a parable. Imagine, he said, a man is wounded by a poisoned arrow, and his friends rush him to a surgeon. But the man refuses treatment. He demands to know who shot him, what caste the shooter belonged to, what kind of bow was used, what kind of feather was on the arrow. He will not allow the surgeon to remove the arrow until all these questions are answered. The Buddha paused. That man would die before he ever found his answers. In this story, the poisoned arrow is suffering. The unnecessary questions are metaphysical speculation. In the treatment, the only thing that matters is the path that leads to the end of suffering. What, then, was the danger in answering such questions? Why not simply say, yes, there is a God, or no, there is not? Why not declare the world eternal or not? Because to answer these questions is to affirm the very framework that keeps the mind bound, a framework that assumes permanence, selfhood, and a fixed reality. To speculate is to reify is to cling, and to cling is to suffer. The Buddha knew that even a right answer given to a wrong question only deepens delusion. He saw that the mind's craving for certainty, for absolute truths, for final explanations, is the same mind that clings to I, me, and mine, and so he would not feed it. He refused to give the ego more ground on which to build its house. Moreover, he saw the trap behind such questions. If one declares that the world was created by a god, then suffering is justified. because it comes from a divine plan. If one says there is no creator, then despair may follow, for life appears meaningless. In both cases, the question misses the point. The real revolution in the Buddha's teaching was not to replace one metaphysics with another, but to transcend the need for metaphysics entirely. He did not argue over the shape of the world. He pointed to the mirror of the mind. He did not chart the beginning of time. He showed how to be free now. There is a word in Pāli, adhikavakara, beyond logic. The Dhamma, he said, is not reached through reasoning alone. It is to be seen directly through insight into the rising and passing of all things. And so when someone asked about beginnings, he redirected them to endings. What is the origin of the world? They asked. What is the origin of suffering? He replied. What happens to the Tathagata after death? What happens to the clinging mind now? Is the universe created? Is the mind creating this very moment? Again and again. The Buddha returned to the same principle, dependent origination, the arising of phenomena due to conditions, and their cessation when those conditions end. This was not speculation. It was experience, observable within oneself. To a world addicted to certainty, this was a strange medicine. To those looking for a divine plan, this was not the answer they sought. But to those who truly wanted liberation, it was the only path that worked. The Buddha refused to answer not because he lacked the answers, but because he had something better, a way out. And in that silence, deeper than the thunder of all gods, he offered a radical kind of freedom, one not granted from above, but realized within. These questions are not connected to the goal. They do not lead to peace, to direct knowledge, to nibbana. That is why I do not answer them. The question, who created the world, is among the oldest ever asked by human beings. It seems simple, almost innocent, but hidden beneath it lies a nest of assumptions so deeply rooted that few ever notice them. The Buddha, however, did. He saw that behind the desire for a creator was not just curiosity, but craving, a deep, unexamined yearning for stability, for control, for meaning projected onto the vast unknown. The idea of a creator comforts the mind precisely because it resolves the terrifying mystery of existence with a single, powerful cause. Someone made this. But the Buddha was not interested in comforting stories. He was interested in truth. To ask, who created the world, assumes that the world is a thing, a fixed, external object that had a definite beginning. It assumes linear time, a moment of creation followed by everything else. It assumes permanence and agency, that there was an unchanging being who initiated change. And it assumes that suffering, evil, and imperfection all flow from the decisions of this being. What happens when we do not question these assumptions? We end up worshiping our projections. We create a God in our own image, one who thinks like us, plans like us, desires like us, but magnified to cosmic proportions. In this view, the Creator becomes a supreme version of ourselves, and we become eternal dependents in His story. The individual dissolves into a divine narrative written by someone else. The Buddha saw that this very framework was the prison. In the Pāli Suttas, the Buddha described a powerful being named Mahabrahma, a god who, after a long period of cosmic dissolution, found himself alone in a vast, empty realm. Over time, other beings appeared there, drawn by past karmic causes. But not understanding this process, they assumed that Brahma had created them. And Brahma, deluded by his own memory, believed it too. This myth is not merely a rejection of a specific deity, it is a psychological parable. It shows how beings, even divine ones, can fall into ignorance when they fail to see the law of causality. The desire to see a beginning becomes so strong that the mind invents one, and then clings to it. The Buddha's insight cut through this delusion with surgical precision. He taught that existence is not created, but conditioned. Things do not emerge from a divine mind, but from causes and conditions, an endless interplay of mental and physical phenomena, arising and passing moment by moment. He refused to trace the world to a single first cause because in dependent origination, there is no absolute beginning. Every condition arises from another. Every effect becomes a new cause. In this web of causality, to look for a first is like asking which spoke of a wheel comes first as it turns. Moreover, the very idea of a creator assumes control. But the Buddha saw that even gods are bound by karma. They may dwell in long-lived realms, but they are not free. They too will die. They too will fall. And if even the highest beings are not outside the law of cause and effect, then no one rules the cosmos, because nothing is outside the cosmos. This does not mean that the Buddha denied the existence of gods. In fact, the early texts mention many divine beings, some compassionate, some confused, some wise, some foolish. But none of them are portrayed as omnipotent, omniscient, or responsible for the creation of the world. The gods, like humans, are simply part of the cycle, sasra, wandering from birth to birth according to their deeds. In this way, the Buddha dismantled the question of creation not by arguing against it, but by showing its irrelevance. When one sees reality clearly, the question evaporates, like a mirage seen through from within. He asked instead, what is the cause of suffering? This shift is profound. It takes the mind out of the abstract and into the immediate. Rather than speculate on distant origins, the Buddha pointed to the here and now, rather than trace the past. He urged us to understand the present, because in seeing the nature of this very moment, we see all of reality. A creator implies dependence, hierarchy, worship. But a conditioned world implies freedom, the ability to break the chain by understanding its links. In a created world, the self is at the mercy of its maker. But in a conditioned world, the self is a process, and processes can be understood, transformed, and ended. So what is a creator? For the Buddha, the better question was, what is the mind projecting when it longs for one? And once that projection is seen for what it is, a story shaped by fear and desire, it no longer holds the same power. In that seeing, we begin to step out of the story and into freedom. He who sees dependent origination sees the Dhamma. He who sees the Dhamma sees dependent origination. When the Buddha awakened under the Bodhi tree, what he saw was not a god, a heaven, or a soul. He saw a process, a chain of arising and ceasing that explained not only the world outside, but the very experience of self. That vision would later be expressed in a single, revolutionary phrase. Paikasamupta, dependent origination. This was not a metaphysical theory, nor a mystical revelation. It was a precise map of how suffering arises and how it can cease. In just 12 interlinked steps, the Buddha described the entire architecture of bondage, from ignorance to old age and death, from not seeing to endlessly becoming. And the most astonishing part? There was no creator anywhere in it. No God made the chain. No soul passed through it. It moved not by command, but by conditions like fire passing from candle to candle, with no single flame being the same, yet no gap between them. Reality, seen in this light, was not made. It was unfolding, moment by moment, lawfully, impersonally, dependently. Here is how the Buddha described it. With ignorance as condition, formations arise. With formations as condition, consciousness arises. With consciousness as condition, name and form arises. And so on, down to birth, aging, and death. This is not a chain of time, but a chain of dependence. At each link, one thing arises because another does. The entire universe, mental and physical, is like this. And crucially, this chain is not fixed. It can be broken. That is the promise of the Dhamma. But let us pause. This teaching, so central to the Buddha's realization, directly undermines the very idea of a divine creator. Not through denial, but by rendering the concept unnecessary. Why posit a supreme being to explain the universe, when the universe explains itself through causes? Why imagine a divine plan, when each moment arises from the conditions of the last? In this light, asking who made this becomes as pointless as asking who makes the shadow that follows your body. There is no need to explain it with external power. It is simply the natural result of position and light. The same is true of mind, of body, of birth, of suffering. They are shadows cast by conditions. This was the Buddha's radical break with the spiritual traditions of his time. While others spoke of the self, Atman, eternal, unchanging, cosmic, the Buddha saw that even the sense of self was a result of conditions. There was no core, no essence, no creator behind the curtain, only a play of elements rising and falling. The very structure of Paikasamupta excludes a creator. For if everything arises through mutual dependency, then nothing stands alone. A creator, by definition, would have to exist independently of what it creates. But in dependent origination, nothing is independent. All things are co-arising. And this insight is not only philosophical, it is liberating. If your suffering were caused by a god, you would have to beg that god for mercy. If it were caused by fate, you would have to accept your lot. But if your suffering arises from causes, and those causes are within your field of understanding, then you are not trapped. This is the hidden compassion behind the Buddha's silence on the Creator. He did not give us a divine being to believe in. He gave us a path to walk. He offered not a father to worship, but a mirror to look into. And in that mirror, we do not see the face of a god. We see the engine of becoming, the fire of craving, the illusion of permanence. And we also see the possibility of cessation. In fact, the Buddha emphasized not just the arising of phenomena, but their ceasing. Just as things arise due to conditions, they also fade away when those conditions cease. This, he said, is the essence of wisdom, not knowing how things begin, but understanding how they end. Whatever has the nature to arise also has the nature to cease. This was the true message beneath the formula of dependent origination, not a creation story, but a liberation story. Not, how did the world begin, but how does suffering end? And in that shift from origin to cessation, from creator to condition, the Buddha dismantled thousands of years of metaphysical confusion with a single principle. It was not a divine voice, but a silence that echoed more deeply than scripture. It was not a commandment, but a pattern, subtle, impersonal, liberating. It was not belief in a higher power, but understanding of what is here. Now, in this breath, this moment, this mind. No God needed. When this is, that is. With the arising of this, that arises. When this is not, that is not. With the cessation of this, that ceases. It would be a mistake to say the Buddha denied the existence of a God in the way a modern atheist might. His path was not rooted in opposition. He did not set out to refute a creator, but to render the question meaningless by transcending the entire framework in which it arises. To deny a God is still to engage with the concept. It is to accept its terms and then say no. But the Buddha's silence, his noble silence, was neither yes nor no. It was a step beyond the debate, a letting go. This subtlety is often missed. The Brahmins of his time speculated endlessly about Brahma, the supposed highest being, pure and eternal. The Jains taught of an eternal self entangled in karma that must be purified. The materialists denied all of it, proclaiming that everything ends with death. And in this noisy landscape of declarations, denials, and debates, the Buddha stood alone, quiet, unmoved. He was not indifferent. He simply saw that all these views, however grand, were part of the same prison, the mind's need to grasp, to define, to build a story around the self and the world. Even the idea of non-existence is still an idea. Even denying a soul is still thinking in terms of soul. The Buddha's insight was deeper. Freedom does not come from having the right answers, but from seeing the nature of questioning itself. To transcend is to see the emptiness of the question, not as nihilism, but as clarity. When one looks deeply into the craving for a creator, a self, a fixed reality, one sees not a profound mystery, but a profound fear. The fear of groundlessness. The fear that there is no one behind the curtain. But that groundlessness is not a flaw. It is the key to liberation. Everything the Buddha taught was aimed at ending suffering, not at explaining the world. He saw that metaphysical questions, while fascinating to the intellect, do nothing to free the heart. On the contrary, they entangle us in identity, opinion, and conceptual proliferation. In the Kamlankya Sutta, MN 63, the Buddha makes this point clear. He lists 10 speculative views on the eternity or finitude of the world, on the existence of the Tathagata after death, on the nature of the self, and says that they do not lead to the goal. They do not bring peace, direct knowledge, or liberation. What does? Understanding the Four Noble Truths, seeing the process of suffering arise and cease, walking the path of ethical conduct, meditation, and wisdom. This is why the Buddha remained silent, not because he was hiding some higher truth, but because he refused to trade freedom for opinion. He once said, "I teach only suffering and the end of suffering." Within that simple phrase lies a teaching more profound than any cosmology. Because if one fully understands suffering not as pain, but as clinging, as identity, as the attempt to hold on to what is always slipping away, then one no longer needs to ask what created the world. One sees how the world is created in each moment by the mind. And in seeing that, one begins to let go. This letting go is not despair. It is not the cold void of nihilism. It is release. It is peace. It is the ending of the endless project of becoming. It is the discovery that there is nothing to stand on and nothing that needs to be. What, then, is transcendence? It is not rising above the world or reaching some higher plane or merging with a cosmic source. It is simply this, the cessation of fabrication, the stopping of the mind's constant grasping, building, projecting, the end of I-making and mind-making. It is not arriving at a new belief, but abandoning the need for belief entirely. In this way, the Buddha offered a vision of reality that is radically non-theistic, not because it denies God, but because it no longer requires the concept. The machinery of craving that would invent such a being has been disassembled. The projections have stopped. The silence remains. And in that silence, one does not find the Creator, but something far more intimate. The end of becoming. The unbinding of the not. The stillness beyond question. Nibbana. He who has no attachment to name or form. Who does not cling to existence, for him there is no fear, no becoming, no ending. He has gone beyond all views. Anguttara Nikaya. It is one of the most striking facts in the history of world religions. The Buddha, despite the profound depth of his teaching and the immense influence it would have across millennia, never wrote a single word. He composed no holy book. He left behind no scrolls, no signature, no sacred object inscribed with his doctrine. And this was not an oversight. It was intentional. The Buddha's path was not one of scripture, but of direct experience. He did not want his teaching to be fossilized in ink. He wanted it to be remembered, practiced, embodied, and lived. This choice was deeply rooted in the nature of the Dhamma itself. The Dhamma was not a static set of doctrines. It was a living process. It was not a set of beliefs to be memorized, but a reality to be realized. And realization is not an act of reading, it is an act of awakening. The truth, as the Buddha saw it, could not be captured in symbols. It had to be seen directly, within one's own body and mind. This is why, from the very beginning, the Dhamma was transmitted orally, through chanting, repetition, memorization, and communal recitation. The monks and nuns of the early saga learned entire discourses by heart, not just as information, but as rhythm, breath, and sound. The teachings were not held in books. They were held in the bones of living practitioners. And yet this was more than just practicality. It was philosophy. Writing creates permanence. It freezes meaning. It turns dynamic understanding into fixed form. The Buddha knew that once a teaching is written down, it becomes interpreted rather than experienced. It becomes an object of debate, ownership, and dogma. But the Dhamma was not meant to be possessed. In fact, the Buddha warned that clinging even to his own teachings could become a fetter. He likened his words to a raft, useful for crossing the river, but to be left behind once the other shore is reached. Clinging to the raft, or carrying it after the crossing, is foolishness. The Dhamma is like a raft, for crossing, not for holding. Alagitapama Sutta, MN 22. This is a strikingly non-doctrinal attitude for a religious founder. The Buddha offered no creeds to be memorized, no sacred text to be defended. Instead, he emphasized personal verification. The Dhamma was to be tested, tasted, lived. He even encouraged his followers to challenge his words if they did not lead to wisdom, peace, and release. Do not go by hearsay, but when you know for yourselves, these things are skillful, these things are blameless, then you should enter and abide in them. Kalama Sutta, in 365. This radical invitation to verify truth for oneself meant that writing the teaching down too early could ossify it into something it was never meant to be. A religion of belief rather than a discipline of insight. So for centuries, the Dhamma remained unwritten. Instead, it was sung. The early texts were composed in a style meant to be recited aloud. Rhythmic, repetitive, rich in mnemonic devices. Pāli, the language of the canon, was not just a linguistic choice, it was a sonic instrument. The monks trained their memories like musicians, preserving the tone and tempo of the discourses with astonishing precision. This oral tradition was not casual, it was systematic. Recitation groups, mutual cross-checking, and frequent communal gatherings ensured fidelity. Senior monks would pass on teachings to younger ones in lineages of sound, breath, and memory. In this way, the Dhamma lived in the air, not on the page. The result was one of the most precise oral traditions in human history, lasting several hundred years before being committed to writing in Sri Lanka around the 1st century BCE. And even then, the act of writing was considered a safeguard against external threats, famine, war, the decline of memory, not a sign of spiritual progress. But what was gained in preservation came at a cost. Once the Dhamma became text, it also became interpretable. Schools of thought emerged. Commentaries multiplied. Debates sharpened. The directness of the Buddha's voice, once carried from breath to breath, began to compete with the voices of later scholars. The living sound became a library of books. Still, the spirit of the oral tradition survives. Even today, in Theravada countries, Pāli chanting remains central. Monastics memorize suttas. Recitation continues. And most importantly, the teaching is still passed down not as a philosophy, but as a practice, something to be seen in one's own mind, not merely read in ink. The Buddha's refusal to write anything down was not a lack of foresight. It was a profound act of non-attachment. He did not want to be remembered as a figure, an author, or even a teacher in the conventional sense. He wanted the Dhamma to speak for itself through experience. By avoiding the pen, he pointed to what cannot be written. By refusing to create a book, he offered instead a path. And by relying on the breath and memory of his disciples, he created a tradition that was not bound by paper, but by living presence. The Dhamma is well proclaimed by the Blessed One, to be seen here and now, timeless, inviting inspection, onward leading, to be experienced by the wise for themselves. Among the many silent revolutions the Buddha set in motion, one of the most radical was this: truth is not something you can own. You cannot possess it, brand it, weaponize it, or even truly believe in it, the way people usually believe in ideas. The Dhamma, as he taught it, is not a property. It is a mirror, clear, empty, reflecting only what is. This is why the Buddha never claimed to create the Dhamma. He discovered it, like someone walking through a forest and finding a long-lost path. He did not lay down the trail himself. He saw what had always been there, hidden beneath the overgrowth of delusion. The Dhamma was not his invention. It was the nature of things. He was not the author of truth, but its revealer. Whether there is an enlightened one or not, this law remains, the law of dependent origination, the fixed order of nature. Ita. Because of this, the Dhamma cannot be turned into an ideology. It resists capture. The moment you try to enclose it within a belief system, a doctrine, or a sectarian badge, it slips through your fingers. You can chant it, yes. You can recite the texts. But if your heart is clinging to identity, this is our truth. That is their error. Then the mirror has already been smudged. The Buddha never said, believe in me. He said, come and see, ehipasiko. This simple phrase reveals the entire character of his teaching. Open, testable, universal. The Dhamma is not meant to be swallowed whole. It is meant to be seen clearly. But there is a catch. To see the Dhamma, you must be willing to look without filters, without ego, without craving. You must lay down your desire to be right, to win, to hold on to some comforting view. You must meet the truth on its terms, not yours. This is what makes the Dhamma so difficult and so freeing. Most religions ask you to believe. Buddhism, as the Buddha taught it, asks you to see. And to see clearly is to be changed. Not because you now believe something new, but because the illusion of someone who believed or disbelieved has begun to fade. This is why the Dhamma cannot be sold. It cannot be franchised, copyrighted, or turned into an exclusive club. If it is real, it belongs to no one. If it is not worth having. The Buddha's teaching is not a trademark, it is a tool. And when used correctly, the tool disappears, leaving only the understanding it revealed. Just as one uses a raft to cross a river and then leaves it behind, so too must one abandon even the Dhamma once the goal is reached. This non-ownership also explains why the Buddha never appointed a single successor. He did not establish a hierarchy of power or a lineage of divine authority. Instead, when asked who would lead the Sangha after his passing, he said, "Let the Dhamma and Vinaya be your teacher after I am gone. Not a person, not a prophet, not a pope, just the principle, the mirror." He knew that the moment spiritual authority is placed in a single hand, the temptation to possess truth arises. And with possession comes exclusion, conflict, division. But when the Dhamma is allowed to stand on its own free of ownership, it becomes a common ground for all who wish to see. This is why the early Sangha was not based on dogma, but on discipline. Not belief, but conduct. The Vinaya, or monastic code, served as the structure within which individuals could train their minds to see the Dhamma for themselves. It wasn't about being right. It was about being free from delusion. And in that freedom, no one can own anything, not even the truth. This is profoundly humbling. It means that awakening is not a badge to wear or a title to claim. It is the end of claiming, the end of mine. Even the idea of my enlightenment is seen as a subtle form of clinging. The true Dhamma is not something you can belong to. It is something that dissolves the need to belong. Like a mirror, it shows you what's there, not what you want to see. And the more clearly you see, the less you need to hold on to anything. Not views, not identities, not even the Dhamma itself. In this way, the Dhamma is not a possession, it is a letting go. And so the Buddha, though he spoke for 45 years, never asked to be followed blindly. Though he walked among kings, he never claimed dominion. Though his teaching spread across continents, he never stamped his name upon it. He simply pointed, a finger to the moon, a raft to the shore, a mirror to the mind. What you do with that pointing is up to you. But the moment you try to make it yours, it vanishes. Those who see the Dhamma see me. Those who see me see the Dhamma. There is a subtle danger that lurks within even the most sincere study of the Dhamma. It is the illusion that understanding the words is the same as realizing the truth. That knowledge of the teachings equals freedom from suffering. That to be learned in suttas and fluent in Pāli is to walk the path. But the Buddha's path was never a matter of intellectual mastery. It was always a matter of direct experience. The Dhamma is not a philosophy. It is a fire. You cannot understand fire by reading about it. You must feel its warmth. You must be burned. This is why. Again and again, throughout the Nikayas, the Buddha speaks not in abstractions but in practical terms. He uses images rooted in experience, a snake mistaken for a rope, a poisoned arrow that must be removed rather than analyzed, a man drowning while clinging to the raft that saved him. These images speak not to scholars, but to human beings, to the existential tension that each of us carries in our bones. And they point, always, not to ideas but to insight, that radical inner seeing which cuts through illusion. Like a sword through smoke. The living transmission of the Dhamma depends on this. It is not a chain of words, but a continuity of vision. A monk does not become a true heir of the Buddha because he has memorized 1,000 verses. He becomes an heir only when he has seen what the Buddha saw, the impermanence of all things, the emptiness of self, the cessation of craving. Though one recites many teachings, if he does not live in accordance with them, he is like a cowherd counting another's cattle. This is why the Sangha, the community of noble disciples, was always defined not by robes or rituals, but by realization. The true Sangha, the Buddha said, is composed of those who have seen the Dhamma for themselves, in any form, be they stream enterers, once returners, non-returners, or arahants. Their transmission is not written, it is embodied. They carry the teaching not in books, but in how they walk, speak, eat, sit, and breathe. And so the Dhamma lives through them, not as a preserved artifact, but as a living presence. It shines in their equanimity. It hums in their restraint. It glows in their simplicity. One might not even understand their language, yet still sense. This one is free. That's the real transmission. This is why the Buddha placed so much emphasis on direct seeing. In Pāli, the term sandahiko, to be seen here and now, is used repeatedly to describe the Dhamma. It is not distant, not hidden, not theoretical. It is immediate, available, but only to those who stop grasping at concepts and look within. There are countless stories in the suttas of people who attained insight not through elaborate study, but through a single moment of clear seeing. A monk listening to a verse, a woman hearing a simile, a layman watching his breath. In that instant, the Dhamma ignites, not because they believed it, but because they realized it. Study is not wrong. It is a support, a guide, a lamp in the darkness. But the lamp is not the light itself. And there is a grave risk in confusing the map for the territory. In worshipping the words, we may forget the silence behind them. In mastering the texts, we may neglect the heart's transformation. The Buddha warned of this often. He compared his teachings to a snake. If grasped wrongly, it can bite. He compared Dhamma knowledge without Dhamma practice to a well-decorated tomb, beautiful on the outside, hollow within. True transmission, then, is experiential. And this is precisely why the Dhamma cannot be mass-produced. It cannot be fully captured in lectures or media or slogans. No video, no book, not even this one, can substitute for your own turning inward, for the intimate work of watching your thoughts, feeling your breath, seeing your clinging, and slowly, patiently, letting go. The Buddha's teaching survives not because it is brilliant, but because it works. Because in each generation, some few walk the path. They sit under trees. They hold precepts. They watch their minds. They step back from the noise of the world. And in the silence that follows, the same insight dawns. There is no self. There is no controller. There is only rising and falling, arising and passing away. And when craving ceases, there is peace. That realization is the living transmission. It needs no words. In the end, to know the Dhamma is not to quote it, but to become it. One who sees the Dhamma sees me. One who sees me sees the Dhamma. Every time the Dhamma crosses a language barrier, something sacred trembles, not because it is fragile, but because it is profound. The Dhamma is not just a body of ideas. It is an invitation to awakening, encoded in a language shaped by silence, breath, and liberation. And when it is translated, something subtle, yet vital, is always lost. The Buddha spoke in a language that was not only practical, but vibrational. The early discourses were delivered in Magadhi and later preserved in Pāli, not because these tongues were holy, but because they were rooted in the lived experience of his time. These were the words of farmers, wanderers, and meditators. But more than their vocabulary, it was their structure, rhythm, and sound that carried the Dhamma's transformative power. Pāli, for instance, is deeply experiential in its design. It does not name things abstractly, it describes processes. It does not say, the mind is impermanent. It says, mind arises and ceases. There is no static self, no fixed noun at the center of experience. Everything is verb-like, in motion, interdependent. And this linguistic fluidity reflects the Buddha's insight. That reality is not made of things, but of changing conditions. But when we translate this into modern languages, especially English, with its heavy reliance on identity and objectification, we risk distorting the message. We turn anatta into no self, which sounds like a doctrine. We render dukkha as suffering, which narrows a rich, multifaceted term into mere pain. We even translate nibbana as extinction or bliss, depending on the translator's mood, when in truth, it points to the cooling of craving, something more intimate and inexpressible. And so, translation becomes not just a technical problem, but a spiritual one. How do you express the ungraspable in a language designed for grasping? How do you describe the end of identity using words that constantly reinforce identity? The danger is not simply misunderstanding. It is reifying, turning what is meant to be an insight into a belief, a formula, a thing. When anatta becomes a doctrine instead of a perception, we lose the path. When paiccasamupta is flattened into a metaphysical system, we miss its existential urgency. These concepts are meant to be looked through, not clung to. They are windows, not walls. The Buddha understood this. He often refused to answer speculative questions, not because he didn't know, but because he knew that language could become a trap. When asked about the beginning of the world, the existence of the soul, or the nature of the cosmos, he remained silent, not out of ignorance, but out of compassion, for he saw that the wrong kind of inquiry leads away from liberation. These questions are not useful. They do not lead to dispassion, to peace, to direct knowledge, to nibbana. This is why the Dhamma was preserved orally for centuries. In speech, there is tone, there is pause, there is presence. The teacher and the listener breathe the same air. The words are not isolated, they are alive. When a teaching is heard, it resonates not just in the mind, but in the body. The rhythm of the sutta, the chant of a verse, the softness or strength in the teacher's voice, all of these transmit something that cannot be written. But writing and translation freeze the fluid. They capture the sound but lose the silence behind it. And silence, paradoxically, is where the Dhamma truly lives. This does not mean we abandon translation. Without it, the Dhamma would be lost to most of the world. But we must approach it with humility. To translate the Buddha's words is not merely to replace one vocabulary with another. It is to attempt the impossible, to speak of the unspoken, to explain what can only be known by seeing. Perhaps this is why the Buddha's deepest truths were often framed as negations. Not self, not mine, not permanent. He avoided affirmative metaphysics. He didn't say, this is what the soul is, but there is no enduring self here. He didn't say, this is bliss, but where craving ends. There is peace. Language that negates points away from clinging, away from false certainty. It doesn't explain, it clears space for seeing. This is also why, in many places, the Buddha emphasized personal realization over doctrinal purity. You do not need to be a scholar to awaken. You do not need to master the terms. What matters is whether the mind is becoming freer, lighter, more compassionate, whether suffering is diminishing, whether clinging is fading. And sometimes, paradoxically, it is those who know the least Pāli who see the Dhamma most clearly because they don't get caught in words. They listen with their hearts. So what is the way forward? We translate, but with reverence. We study, but with mindfulness. We speak the words, but point beyond them. We remember that the Dhamma is not in the letters on the page, but in the truth they are trying to evoke. Like a finger pointing to the moon, like a raft that helps us cross the river, like a mirror that shows us what we truly are. And once we see clearly, we let go of the finger, the raft, the mirror. Even the words of the Buddha must be left behind if they are to fulfill their purpose. Because awakening is not a matter of language. It is a matter of seeing what is and being changed by it. The wise do not cling even to the Dhamma, how much less to what is not Dhamma. Before there were books, before the Tipiyaka was etched into palm leaves, there was sound, vibration, voice. And within that voice lived the Dhamma, not as dead doctrine, but as a living resonance passed from heart to heart, breath to breath. This is the overlooked power of Pāli chanting. To modern ears, it may seem archaic, ritualistic, even meaningless, just monks reciting words in a dead language. But for those who understand its roots, chanting is not a performance. It is preservation, not only of memory but of presence. It is how the Dhamma stays alive across time. Imagine the early saga, just after the Buddha's passing. They had no scriptures, no written texts, no printing presses. But they had voices and minds trained in deep mindfulness. They gathered under trees, in caves, in open fields. And they recited, together, in rhythm, in breath. The Dhamma vibrated through their chests not just as sound, but as realization, internalized through disciplined repetition and meditative depth. These weren't mere words. They were vital instructions for freedom, encoded in cadence, tone, and silence. When the monks recited a sutta like the Dhammacakkappavattana, they weren't performing a liturgy. They were spinning the wheel of Dhamma again, bringing it into the living present. The utterance was not separate from the insight. It carried the insight. Why Pāli? Because Pāli was the language of that original fire. It was the container that held the Buddha's voice. Its structure, syntax, and sonic quality were crafted not by scholars, but by generations of oral tradition, shaped for memorization, repetition, and transmission. And chanting was the glue that held it all together. You might wonder, can sound alone transmit insight? Can a chant change the mind? The answer is yes, but only when the chant is contemplated, not just performed. The early monks didn't chant to earn merit. They chanted to train their perception, to shape their inner landscape, to plant the seeds of wisdom deeper than thought. Take the famous refrain from the Satipatthana Sutta, "There is a body, thus he has mindfulness established." These phrases are not poetic. They are precise instructions. In chanting them daily, meditators are not merely remembering, they are realigning their minds, tuning themselves to the frequency of direct experience. In Pāli, the rhythm of the syntax helps the mind stay anchored, alert, balanced. This is why, even today, monks memorize entire books of the canon, not to show off, but to carry the Dhamma within. In places where texts are rare or education is limited, chanting ensures that the teachings are never lost. Even if every book were to burn, the Dhamma would still survive, in breath, in voice, in memory. And chanting does more than preserve. It also protects. In Buddhist cultures, certain chants are used for blessing, for warding off fear, for calming the mind in illness or death. These are not magic spells. Their power lies not in superstition, but in the purity of intention and the clarity of presence. A mind that chants the Metta Sutta with genuine loving-kindness generates a field of compassion, real, measurable, and transformative. Even for lay people, chanting offers a way to connect with the Dhamma beyond intellect. In the daily repetition of short verses like, "May all beings be happy," there is a softening of the self, a training of the heart, a return to sincerity. In a world cluttered with opinions and ego, this simple act can become a gateway to stillness. There's also something powerful in the communal aspect of chanting. When voices rise together, not in performance, but in shared sincerity, a sense of separation fades. The many become one. The ego melts into rhythm. The Dhamma becomes a shared vibration that transcends race, class, culture, or era. And through this, the teachings remain unchanged in essence, even as the world changes around them. Of course, chanting alone is not enough. As the Buddha said, just as a musician who knows the melody but plays without mindfulness creates only noise, so too a reciter without reflection gains no wisdom. Chanting must be paired with contemplation. One must listen inwardly. Ask, what is this verse pointing to? What delusion is it cutting through? What truth does it demand I see for myself? Only then does sound become silence. Only then does the outer voice awaken the inner eye. And here lies the greatest secret of all. Pāli chanting is not about words. It is about awakening. It is a language whose true meaning is only unlocked through practice, through stillness, through seeing. So next time you hear the steady cadence of monks chanting, don't listen with your intellect. Feel with your breath. Let the sound wash through the noise of the mind. Beneath the syllables, beyond the verses, lies a silence that has never changed, a silence that points to the same truth the Buddha saw beneath the Bodhi tree. There is suffering. There is a cause. There is a cessation. And there is a path. This is the sound of awakening, not just in Pāli, but in every heart that listens. Well spoken, well spoken, well spoken, not as praise, but as an echo of truth recognized. When the Buddha passed into Parinibbana beneath the twin sala trees of Kusinara, the world fell silent. No more footsteps across dusty paths. No more sermons beneath mango groves. No more raised eyebrows or quiet smiles to pierce delusion. His physical voice was gone, but the truth he had awakened to, and the living way he had taught it, remained. Not because it was written, but because it was remembered, recited, lived. The miracle of the Buddha's legacy is not that it was recorded in books centuries later. The miracle is that, for nearly 500 years, it was not written at all, and yet, it survived. It endured through wars, migrations, political collapses, and shifting cultures. It crossed mountains and oceans without ever being engraved on stone or sealed in ink. Why? Because the Buddha's voice was never meant to be preserved. It was meant to be kept alive. And it was alive because people lived it. The monks who memorized the discourses did not do so for prestige. They did so to ensure that liberation could continue to be touched by those yet unborn. The Sangha chanted not to perform rituals, but to keep the Dhamma vibrating in time, echoing from mind to mind, like the striking of a bell that still rings even after the hand is left. But the oral tradition was more than technique. It was an act of devotion, a trust that the truth could be held not in monuments, but in human hearts. We live in an age where everything is written, recorded, streamed, and stored. But in this sea of information, it is easy to forget. The Dhamma is not data. It is not a thing to be collected, but a light to be realized, a path to be walked, a silence to be entered. The oral tradition reminds us that the deepest truths cannot be captured in print. They must be embodied. They must be spoken with presence, heard with stillness, and seen with one's own eye of wisdom. And this is why the Buddha's voice never died. Every time a practitioner closes their eyes and watches the breath, the voice returns. Every time a monk recites the words, "Eva me sutta, thus have I heard," the Buddha lives again, not as a memory, not as a man, but as the timeless principle of awakening echoing through consciousness. The oral tradition is not about preserving the past. It is about keeping the present awake. As long as one person hears the Dhamma with an open heart, as long as one voice recites it with sincerity, as long as one mind realizes for itself, this is not me, not mine, not self, then the Buddha has. He speaks still, not from a throne in heaven, but from the silence between two breaths. The Dhamma is well proclaimed by the Blessed One, to be seen here and now, timeless, inviting inspection, leading onward, to be realized by the wise each for themselves. And so the voice continues, not in books, not in statues, but in the living tradition that refuses to fossilize truth into doctrine, that understands the Buddha's greatest gift was not his words, but the freedom those words point to. And that gift can never be lost, so long as there are beings willing to listen not just with ears, but with awakened hearts.